Hello, hello. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to make Twitch badges and emotes. Disclaimer, these are just my preferences through my experience and the things that I've learned. I'm not saying it's the right way or the only way, I'm just showing you how I do it. If you do things differently and have any tips of your own, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. Also worth mentioning that this is my first tutorial on anything ever, so just keep that in mind while watching. With that being said, let's get into it. Okay, I want to start off with a couple of notes. Feel free to come back to this part and pause it, or you can just screenshot it. All the information on the text slides will also be within the video itself. When it comes to canvas size, I personally prefer to create something bigger than what I actually need it for. Some people prefer to work on a canvas that is the exact dimensions of whatever emote or badge that they're working on, because that saves them the hassle of having to resize later. I like to draw larger because it allows me extra leeway in case I want to use the graphic for something different. Remember, if you downsize something, your quality will be fine. But if you upsize something, the quality is going to end up distorted. So for me, this is just kind of insurance. Typically, I'm working on a canvas that's around 1500 by 1500, always 300 dpi. And immediately when I get in, I go ahead and change the background color from white to a light gray, around 25%. I feel like this allows you to more accurately see what colors you're working with. Then I create a new layer and go to the textures panel of the brush menu. I select the grid, draw it on the canvas, any color is fine, then I just enlarge it. You could also go to Google and grab an image of a grid if you find that easier. I drop the opacity so that I'm able to see it, but it's not going to be distracting to whatever else I'm drawing. If you need symmetry at some point, you'll click on the tool icon, select canvas, and then drawing guide. You turn the little button on, then you click edit drawing guide, and then under symmetry, I think there's like an advanced options tab. I usually just do vertical. Every now and then I'll do vertical and horizontal, or just horizontal, but most of the time, for me at least, I'm gonna only be using vertical. If you feel like the symmetry tool isn't working for you, make sure that your layer is set to drawing assistance. It'll have a little check mark, and also make sure that you're working on the provided symmetry line. It's usually in the center of the canvas. If you find that that guide is a little bit difficult to see, you can actually go in and change the options for that. You can do a thicker line or a brighter color or whatever helps. Here are the brushes I always use. You of course don't have to use these exact brushes, but I do believe that they are all default brushes in case you want to. For sketching, I tend to use the crayon smooth brush because I like the texture, but I recommend going with whatever your natural preference is for doodling. I don't think it really matters what brush you use here. For line art, I exclusively use these two brushes. I use them both at full opacity with stabilization around 50%. Stabilization is a great tool. It can help you make cleaner lines, but if it's too high, it can prevent you from making like exact shapes that you want. So just play around with the strength of that and see what works for you. Okay, so the first one is the Studio Pen under the inking tab. It's a little bit thinner and it has a tapered edge, so it's good for making precise lines. The second one is the Monoline brush from the Calligraphy tab, which has a more uniform thickness, meaning it doesn't taper at all. I use that one for outlining the border. For shading, I use the soft brush under the airbrushing tab, and I also use the Studio Pen for drawing in specific highlight and shadow shapes. I'll get more into the details of all of that later. And lastly, we have the blend modes that I like to use. Whenever I use airbrush shading or coloring, I like to use it on a soft light blend mode, and it's around a 50 to 80% opacity. For hard shadows or cell shading, I tend to use a linear burn or multiply, and that's usually around 40 to 80% opacity. And finally, for any stark highlights, I like to use color dodge or add, and that'll only be around 15 to 45%. Again, we'll go over this more in depth when we get to that section. Okay, let's get into the actual drawing process.
Step 1. Brainstorm.
My very first step is always brainstorming. I recommend keeping a note on your phone, or you can keep a journal by your PC just for any random ideas that come up. These are just themes and ideas that you can come back to later when you can't decide what to work on. So in this example, I chose summer/beach, and then I start generating words that make me think of that topic. If you feel like you're not really creative with this kind of thing, or you have an idea but you can't seem to expand on it, I really like using relatedwords.org. You enter any term that you want, and it generates a list of words that are relevant to your topic. Also important to note that you're probably not going to use all of the ideas that you come up with. We're just trying to give ourselves options and freedom to figure out where we want to go with the theme.
Step 2. Sketch.
Once you feel like you have enough ideas, you can begin sketching out the ones that you like the most. This is just putting images to ideas. They don't have to be perfect. They don't even have to be good. We just want to physically get the ideas onto the paper. Or well, canvas, you know. So here I'm just flipping back and forth between my sketch layer and the idea list, kind of picking whatever I'm feeling in the moment. Oh, and what you don't see is that on my PC I have a Google Image tab open for references. This is of course completely optional, but personally I don't have a great recollection of what an oyster looks like or whatever, so for me it's necessary. If you're on iPad, you can also use the multitasking feature and pull up a dual window, or you can use the reference feature within Procreate. Also, there's no obligation to do any certain number of badges or emotes. You can do as many or as few as you like. Like, this is a particularly big badge set. I don't even know if there's enough slots for all of these. I was just having fun, so I kept going. But often I just make 1 or 2 badges or emotes at a time, so go at your own pace and just do however many you feel like.
Step 3. Lineart.
Now we're going to take those designs and clean them up. I drop the opacity on the sketch layer, and then I just cut and paste whatever design I want to work on. I like to see things one by one. It helps me not to get overwhelmed. Also, I imagine you already know this, but please make sure that your new Lineart layer is on a separate layer than your sketches. And since we're working with such small sizes, it's really important to maximize the space that we have. So use your design to fill up the individual squares as much as they can. And I'm using the Studio Pen for the inner lines and the monoline for the outer border lines. I tend to use the symmetry tool quite a bit with badges, more so than with emotes, just because they're such small and simple designs. And a lot of this is just doing the same lines over and over. If you're a digital artist, you probably already know that struggle. Also, sometimes your initial sketch is just not going to work and you have to either redo it or you might want to scrap it completely. That's just part of the process. That's why I like to have more ideas than I actually need. For some details, you'll find that you might not want to do them as Lineart at all, and maybe you'll instead do it on the coloring layer. Or you might want to take a small piece of Lineart and put it on its own layer. So for example, the sparkle I did. I knew that it would be harder to color later if I put it directly on the pearl, so I went ahead and put it on a new layer so that I can color and move it independently. Another thing is, I always try to work smarter, not harder, aka I'm kind of lazy. But if you can take assets of other work you've done and reuse them in a different way, I think that's just efficient. So for example, I know I've drawn a lot of fruit before, so I could have easily just taken a lemon from one of those pieces instead of taking the time to redraw a lemon on the glass pitcher. In another example, I had drawn a gummy bear, and then for Valentine's Day, I took that bear, changed the color, added some stitching, and then it became a plush bear. So if you're able to think creatively, sometimes you can make little shortcuts for yourself. This is especially helpful if you sell your work. Oh, one more tip. So I mentioned that I like to use the Studio Pen for the thinner tapered lines, and then the monoline just for the outer border. However, sometimes it's helpful to add a thicker border to something on the inside if it's an important detail. And this is really more relevant to making emotes than it is badges. For example, if your character is doing a peace sign, you might want to outline that hand. Or maybe they're holding a cup of boba in front of their face and you want that to be a key element. The thicker border can help draw attention to that area. Once I'm totally done with my liner, I will select this layer from the panel and I will set it to reference. This is so you can accurately fill your selections when it comes time to color. I also duplicate this layer and then hide one. I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally made a mistake on my Lineart layer, and it's just a pain to redo it. So, better safe than sorry.
Step 4. Color.
Okay, so I start dropping in base colors, and this is on a new layer underneath the Lineart layer. Feel free to play around with this. You don't have to commit to your first choice. Anything can be any color you want it to be. Although, with badge sets, I do like to have a general color scheme. I feel like it helps it look more cohesive as a set of items. You'll see me pivot and start implementing that in a minute. But this is just my preference. I'm just dragging and dropping. You can also drag the first color, and then there's a button that says continue filling, where you can just tap from then on, and that can save a little bit of time, so that's cool too. If you're having trouble with the color filling, double check that your liner is set to reference, and then play around with the color drop threshold. That's sort of how the program determines what it's allowed to fill.
Step 5. Shade.
So the first type of shading that I'm doing is kind of like pillow shading, where it's lighter in the center and darker towards the edge. Some artists will say that pillow shading is a bit of a no-no. I think if it's subtle and it's combined with other types of shading, then it works. At least in the case of emotes and badges, I think it's an easy way to add dimension. But I will say, I don't even think this step is particularly necessary or impactful. Some people omit this step entirely, or they do a gradient all over. Any of these options are totally fine. I've just always done it and it's super fast, so I continue to do it. So it's a new layer and it's a clipping mask to the coloring layer. I do an all over wash of gray across everything on the canvas, and then go back in with a soft brush and a lighter gray and focus only on the center of each object. I change the blend mode of the layer to soft light, drop it to around 50 to 80% opacity, and then move on to the next thing.
Step 6. Shadows and highlights.
Okay, so we don't only want to have the soft sort of pillow shading. I think that this is a really common beginner technique. I certainly started here. It's not even necessarily a mistake or inherently wrong, but I do think it can lead to your art looking a bit flat. Adding more defined shadows can help portray the shape better and give the form more depth. Personally, I feel like I saw an improvement in the quality of my art once I started doing this. So what we're doing here is essentially cell shading, but I'm not that great at explaining it because I'm honestly not all that great at doing it. So if you're not that familiar with cell shading, it's probably beneficial to go to YouTube and look up specific tutorials on that. There are tons of great ones out there and they can articulate the technique way better than I can. But I'll still walk you through my thought process here and hopefully you can kind of make some sense of that. So I'm working on a new layer, but it's a clipping mask onto the color layer. And I'm using the Studio Pen for drawing in the shapes. I like to do all of my shadows in a light gray, and then when I change the blend mode, then it'll change the colors, and it's actually really satisfying. But that way it just expedites the process because I don't have to continually color pick. It'll essentially do it for me, so I just draw the shapes and then move on to the next one. As for how I'm determining what shape to draw, I actually found that bit pretty hard to explain. I decide on a global light source, which for me seems to always be top right, and then I draw the shadows opposite of that. I tend to always curve my shadows because rounder things tend to read as cuter. And this is something that I noticed all of my favorite emote and badge artists doing. So I decided to start mimicking that and it works for me. So don't be afraid to analyze the work of your favorite artist. You can learn a lot. What do the shapes of their shadows look like? How bright are their highlights? How do they color their line art? How thick are their lines? Try to figure out why you like the things you like and be specific. So once I've drawn in all the shadows, I just change the blend mode to linear burn or multiply and then drop the opacity. That's it for that. Then for the highlights, I try to make them pretty minimal and not overdo it because at a small size, it can get like super muddy. Some people don't think that you should highlight emotes or badges at all, but it's just like ingrained in my style, so I have to do it. And I saw this tip about also highlighting like the rim of the shadow, which I think does make a difference when I do it, so that's a step that I've added in recently. Once I'm done drawing in highlights, I change the blend mode to either color dodge or add, and I drop the opacity to around 10 to 40%.
Step 7. Color line art.
Now we're going to create a clipping mask for the line art layer and then color it. This part's pretty easy. I keep the outermost border black, and then the inner lines get colored a darker shade of whatever they're touching, if that makes sense. I've seen people not color their line art at all and just leave it black. I've seen people add a gradient over the whole thing. So kind of just play around and see what suits your style. And also, when you're testing out these different ideas, try zooming out and see how that will translate to a smaller viewing size. Anyway, there's really not much to say about this step, it's just coloring.
Step 8. Export.
Get almost to the finish line. Now we're going to group and flatten anything that we can, just kind of tidy up your layers. You don't have to do this, but I tend to reuse this same canvas instead of always creating a new one. So for me, this helps just to stay organized. And then when you actually want to export it, you just turn off the background layer and anything else that you don't need. So you only have what looks like the finished badges or emotes. You're going to go back to your gallery and select the art that you just made. Click on share. I always do it as a PNG. If you want to name the file, you can. Honestly, all of mine are just like untitled number 437 or whatever. Like I'll name it later. I always use Google Drive. You can use Dropbox if you want to, or send it to yourself some other way. And then we're going to go retrieve that for the next step.
Step 9. Resize.
Alright, final step. So for resizing, I personally use Photoshop. You can use any program you want, they all do the same thing. Badge sizes are 72 by 72, 36 by 36, and 18 by 18. Emote sizes are 112 by 112, 56 by 56, and 28 by 28. Yes, Twitch has an automatic resizing feature now, however, I don't recommend using it. I mean, if you do, it's fine, but in my experience, it messes with the quality a little bit. So that's just something to be aware of. I know it's slightly more work to do them individually, but I do think it's worth it. So I just create a new 300 dpi canvas, transparent background, whatever size I need, and then I paste the artwork into it, resize it, name, save, and then repeat. This part's kind of tedious, but it's easy. Oh, and something I forgot to actually write on this slide. There are many sites that you can test your emotes and badges before you actually upload them to Twitch, and I find those super helpful. I'll link a couple in the description below. And you are done. Give yourself a little pat on the back for finishing your badges or emotes. Even if it's just small, simple art, you should still be proud of yourself. Okay, and before you head out, let's go back over some of the tips in the video. Clipping masks are your best friend. Use them often. This allows you to experiment with different techniques, colors, blending modes, all without fear of altering your original layer. Always duplicate your Lineart layer just for backup. Relatedwords.org or other keyword generators are great for helping you expand on ideas. As a general rule of thumb, I recommend using thicker outer lines and thinner inner lines. Too much detail at a small size can end up looking muddy, so it's usually best to focus on the most important details. Don't be afraid to experiment and try new things. This is one of the most important tips. Not everything has to be a masterpiece. It's okay to create ugly art or create art that's just for fun that no one will ever see. Have fun in just being creative. And sort of as a follow-up to that, study artists' work that you like. Be specific and be intentional. This can help you hone in your style. It makes you focus on what kind of art you want to be creating, and by practicing often, you learn how to get there. And as a follow-up to that, it's also okay to work smarter and not harder. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. Hopefully all of this makes sense together and the tips don't sound contradictory to each other. The point of this last bit is that I want you to be creative and I want you to experiment, but you don't have to make things difficult for yourself. It's totally fine to take shortcuts. Anyway, I think that about covers it all. If you've learned anything helpful from this video, or if you have any emote or badge tips to share of your own, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. And thank you for watching.